What's so good about being young anyway? You're short, you can't stay up past 9, and depending how young you are exactly, you're probably covered in pimples. Pimples or bedwetting, pick your poison. And yet, for all the downsides, all the restrictions, all the yelling from grown-ups, most of us look back on our childhoods with fondness. Some of us look at children and teenagers with envy, without any bills to pay, or jobs to go to, or cares beyond poking a frog with a stick to see if it's still alive.
With no power comes no responsibility.
The most you had to worry about were your grades, or whether or not the casserole mom was making tonight had onions in it. Yet not everyone gets a true childhood. In poorer families especially, children often pick up a lot of the chores around the house, up to and including helping to raise younger siblings. Many kids suffer abuse from family or from schoolmates, making them eager to graduate high school and get away from their tormentors. And among queer kids, a lot of the stereotypical hallmarks of adolescence are denied you, particularly young romance. A lot of gay men don't really grow up in the same way that their straight peers do, clinging to youthful fashions into their 40s and even older, going out clubbing and hooking up with others like them, trying to make up for not being able to experiment sexually and romantically in high school. This phenomenon is often called Peter Pan syndrome, though that's not an actual clinical diagnosis recognized by any medical authority. But what does growing up even mean? There are the expectations of getting a job and getting married and having kids, which makes a certain amount of sense, as under capitalism you need some way to bring in funds to pay for food and shelter and whatnot, and producing offspring is a fairly crucial endeavor to ensure a continued human population, and it's generally better for those offspring to have more than one parent. But coupled with that are other expectations, notably a dropping of youthful pastimes and interests. Those who keep watching Disney films into adulthood and keep attending theme parks and keep collecting officially branded clothing and merchandise are often derided as Disney adults. Though who am I to talk? That's probably most of my audience. Grown-ups are supposed to stop watching cartoons and playing trading card games and collecting action figures, and are supposed to get into sports and gardening and home improvement. But why? Why does growing up have to mean becoming serious and industrious and, well, dull? Every Christmas, my mother insists on getting me long-sleeved shirts because in her opinion, grown-ups don't wear hoodies. I never wear those long-sleeved shirts because hoods are practical. It's like having a hat attached to your shirt at all times. It's great for the bitter winters of New England, and yet in my mother's view, hoodies are clothing that teenagers wear, not adults. Adults need to wear suits and crop their hair short, though thankfully my mother has stopped trying to convince me to cut my hair. Adults need to get real jobs and be ambitious until they finally retire and go on a couple cruises before they die. This is the exact sort of adulthood that Peter Pan, the eponymous character of J.M. Barrie's play and novel, wanted to avoid. Much like our previous topic of Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan follows British children being isekai'd into a fantastical realm where they have all sorts of adventures before going back home. Mr. Barrie's life was marred by much tragedy, such as the death of his brother David at 14, and the death of his good friends, a married couple with children, the Llewellyn Davies. Barrie took the Llewellyn Davies children in, and it is the stories he told them and his own children that formed the basis for Peter Pan. The name came from Peter, one of the Llewellyn Davies children, as well as from the Greek god of the wilds, Pan. Speaking of the Greeks, preoccupation with youth goes back to them as well, as usual. Eos, goddess of the dawn, fell in love with the Trojan prince Tithonus. She asked Zeus to grant him immortality, but with no other specifications, so as the years passed, he grew older and finally wrinkled away into a grasshopper. So remember, the next time you see one bouncing across your lawn, that little fella got to fuck the sunrise. Eos's sister, Selene, goddess of the moon, did not want to repeat the same mistake, so for her mortal love, Endymion, she requested eternal youth. Thus did Zeus make him sleep forever, never to age. If I'm being honest, I think I'd rather be an unkillable grasshopper that fucks the sun every morning. And yes, both the Greeks and Romans practiced pederasty, where an older man mentors a younger man, usually with a sexual component. The youth was typically adopted this way in his mid to late teens, making this practice statutory rape under any modern definition. However, to be fair, girls were typically married off around the same age and usually had less say in who their husband would be. Zeus himself had a pederastic relationship, having kidnapped the youth Ganymede to be his cupbearer. Yep, that's right, the largest moon of Jupiter is named for Mr. Lightning Bolts' underage coerced boyfriend. Plato justified this practice by claiming that it was good for democracy because these youths would be more loyal to their mentors who fucked them than some would-be tyrant, apparently. In contrast, Aristotle believed that pederasty was a means of population control because if old men are diddling young boys, they're not making babies. But in my view, it seems like those old Greeks were just making excuses to have their way with youthful bodies. Perhaps being with youths made them feel younger themselves. It was about power and control and indoctrinating teenagers through sex. It's absolutely for the best that we left this practice behind, though apparently the guy who claims he shot bin Laden disagrees. Man, 2024, what a year, am I right? From what I can tell, J.M. Barrie did not share Lewis Carroll's preference for fraternizing only with children, having multiple adult friends, including other authors of the time, such as Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, H.G. Wells, the noted science fiction writer, and Rudyard Kipling and Robert Louis Stevenson, whose respective The Jungle Books and Treasure Island we will be discussing in due time. Barrie's fondness for children seemed to be more paternal, though like with Carroll, there have been rumors that he was a pedophile, but also, like with Carroll, there is no actual evidence of this. Barrie is most well known for Peter Pan, which has been receiving adaptations basically since the beginning. The first film version came out in 1924, again by Paramount, with some quite astounding special effects for a silent film. It was this version, as well as the stage play, that made Walt Disney want to try his hand at it. In fact, he invited the actress who played the titular role in the production he saw as a child, Maude Adams, to come view an in-progress mock-up to get her opinion on it. But, in Walt's own words, "She wouldn't even give me the courtesy of looking at her reel. Her reasons were to the effect that Peter, whom she created, was to her real life and blood, while another's creation of this character would only be a ghost to her. It seems pretty silly, and from my point of view, I'd say that Miss Adams is simply living in the past." Sometimes, reading Walt's actual thoughts, it kind of astounds me how he managed to make, or at least oversee, the creation of such good art. It seems sometimes that he didn't really understand how strongly other people felt about things important to them, like getting paid regularly. For a man whose films focus so often on teaching empathy and kindness, he really comes off as quite self-centered. And on that note, Disney's Peter Pan is, like Dumbo, frustrating to talk about, but perhaps more so as actual effort was put into this one. This film was in development hell for almost 2 decades, with it originally set to be the second Disney feature after Snow White. But as with Alice in Wonderland, the studio struggled with how to adapt it, and then World War II happened and changed everyone's plans. By the time they had fulfilled their obligations to the US government and convinced the Bank of America to let them start new feature projects, Mary Blair had gotten her hands on the concept art and made it her own, just as with Alice. And as had become standard, there were plenty of changes made from the source material. A lot of it is minor things or paraphrasing, and as I've said, I care more about a good product than faithfulness, but some of the choices made are a little weird, like switching Captain Hook's hook from his right hand to his left. Specifically this bit where Wendy calls that out.
Oh no, John. It was the left hand.
Because the book went out of its way to specify which hand Peter fed to the crocodile. "What is he like?" asked John. "Is he big?" "He's not as big as he was." "How do you mean?" "I cut off a bit of him." "You?" "Yes, me," said Peter sharply. "I wasn't meaning to be disrespectful." "Oh, all right. But I say, what bit?" "His right hand." "Then he can't fight now." "Oh, can't he just? Left-hander. He has an iron hook instead of a right hand and he claws with it." "Claws?" I get that the point of the exchange is to show how much Wendy knows about Peter Pan, but you had to pick the one fact you changed from the original book. I can understand for a live-action production switching it to the left hand so that the actor can still sword fight with the right, like Dustin Hoffman's eponymous take in Steven Spielberg's Hook, though Jason Isaacs did well enough with his left in the 2003 adaptation. We'll talk about both of those more later, but Disney made an animated film where the whole point is you can do literally whatever you want. Just as with Cinderella and Alice in Wonderland, they shot live-action reference footage, but they could have very easily just mirrored voice actor and reference model Hans Conried to put his hook on the right. I have not been able to find any discussion anywhere on the internet as to why Disney made this change, and I have trawled through a lot of interviews and behind-the-scenes featurettes. There's Nothing. Some of the early concept art for the captain put the hook on his right hand too, so something must have happened during production to warrant the change, but whatever it is, Disney is remaining mum about it. There's also other little things like Mr. Darling's tie being swapped out for cufflinks, but I don't want this to turn into an episode of Lost in Adaptation, so I'll restrain myself to changes that affect plotting and themes rather than aesthetic things and paraphrases that don't really matter.
Pirate! Poppycock!
Both the book and the Disney film begin at the Darling residence, with Mr. and Mrs. Darling preparing to go to a fancy party. It's standard convention for the same actor to play both Mr. Darling and Captain Hook, and Hans Conried is a delight as both of these characters. He started on radio and is just a natural at voice acting. He really sells every line he delivers.
Goodness gracious, whatever shall we do?
But George...
Sound the alarm!
Really?
Call Scotland Yard!
Really, the only production I can think of that doesn't follow that tradition is the Peter Pan Live from 2014, where they somehow roped Christopher Walken into playing Captain Hook, but couldn't pay him enough to play Mr. Darling too, I guess, so they got Mr. Smee's actor to do it instead. It sure does exist.
Peter Pan has found a mother. Oh, yeah. The game is up.
There's then the usual hullabaloo about things fucking up so that Nana is banished to the yard and Wendy is given the ultimatum of,
This is your last night in the nursery.
but here we bump into the fact that this is an American production of a British story. In the book, there is a maid, Liza, who remains at the house while the Darlings are away. But in the United States, most people do not have a maid unless they're really rich. So that character was dropped, maybe because of pacing, maybe to trim down on the number of characters, or maybe because an American audience would not have bought into the whole British propriety thing.
Dash the neighbors.
This cultural misunderstanding would crop up again in the making of Mary Poppins, where Mrs. Banks was made into a suffragette because Walt and the filmmakers under him could not understand why a family would hire a nanny if the mother stayed home all day. To be honest, being American myself, I don't really understand it either, but for Peter Pan, the result is that the Darling children are left completely alone. Maybe things were different in the 1950s, but at least by the 90s when I was a child, there was no way kids would be left on their own for an evening. You would hire a babysitter. So this change kind of makes it seem like the Darlings are just inviting stranger danger.
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
And what stranger is watching the Darlings leave but Peter Pan himself, shrouded in shadow. When Tinker Bell's light illuminates his face, he looks like he's wearing a bandit mask. This is very effective, showing us what a mischievous scamp our main character is and that he is not to be fully trusted. In both the book and essentially every film adaptation, Peter Pan is almost an anti-hero. Sure, he loves fun and being silly, but he can also be cold and callous and will throw a tantrum if things don't go his way. But of course he cared very much, and he was so full of wrath against grown-ups who, as usual, were spoiling everything that as soon as he got inside his tree, he breathed intentionally quick, short breaths at the rate of about 5 to a second. He did this because there's a saying in the Neverland that every time you breathe, a grown-up dies, and Peter was killing them off vindictively as fast as possible. But his foul moods never last long, as it is with any child, and soon enough he's laughing and dancing. There's an irrepressible merriment inside him that can't help bursting forth. "Pan, who and what art thou?" Hook cried huskily. "I'm youth, I'm joy," Peter answered at a venture. "I'm a little bird that has broken out of the egg." And at this point, I actually want to circle back to the very beginning with the narrator. In the book, and every other adaptation of this story, the opening line is, "All children except one grow up." Disney instead went with,
All this has happened before, and it will all happen again.
rather than homing in on the unique youth of Peter Pan, his Endymion-esque state of eternal preservation, we comment on the cyclical nature of this story. At the very end, Mr. Darling comments,
You know, I have the strangest feeling that I've seen that ship before.
This opening line has become iconic in its own right, even inspiring the creators of the Battlestar Galactica reboot.
All of this has happened before.
But the question remains, does all of this have to happen again?
Rather than Peter Pan being a true character defined by his refusal to grow up, he's instead a kind of psychopomp, ferrying children to a land of imagination and back again. Honestly, I find both interpretations very interesting, and I dig that the folks at Disney decided to try something different. Peter's entrance is also marked by his leitmotif, almost like the flute singing his name, Peter Pan. As we watch Peter float down to the nursery window, I just have to say that Disney did Peter's flying the best. Milt Kahl was his animator, and the way he floats through the air is just so convincing. Live action is limited by what you can get away with on wires or other such contraptions, making flesh Peter Pans often look like they're swimming in the air or just hanging as they slowly float in one direction. Animated Peter has speed, energy, not tied to any physical practicalities of motion. He's effortless and weightless.
One of the real challenges for him was animating weightlessness, animating a character who is sort of floating in midair, not flying, but just sort of floating. It's details like that that we in the audience are not supposed to think about. Of course, we shouldn't. We're involved in the story.
And why has Peter come to this window? To listen to Wendy tell stories about him to her brothers John and Michael. For the second film in a row, our female lead is played by Catherine Beaumont, who apparently started work on Peter Pan immediately after finishing her work on Alice in Wonderland. Wendy typically gets the most characterization of the darling children in most adaptations, and Disney's is no exception. But they also made sure to flesh out John and Michael as well. Apparently, John was originally not even going to come along, dismissed by Peter as too rational and cynical and unwilling to believe, but Walt eventually realized that John should come along, and I'm glad because he's a lot of fun.
My name is John. I shall try to be worthy of my post.
In other adaptations, John and Michael tend to get short shrift, and the Lost Boys often blend together, but older Disney films were very good at making side characters distinct and memorable. There are no small parts, only small actors, as the saying goes, and the same applies to animators. The final character introduced here is Tinkerbell, who was not based off of Marilyn Monroe, as rumor would have you believe. Her look was based on Margaret Carey, who did all the live-action reference footage for the fairy. Apparently, when Carey took her husband to see the film, he told her, "I'd recognize those thighs anywhere," which is certainly a line to say to your wife. The original book has quite a few twee moments in it, and each adaptation of it tends to choose which elements of cringe to embrace and which to reject. Disney's Tinkerbell speaks in the tinkling of chimes, just as the book says she does, while the 2003 film has her muttering nonsense, which is certainly a choice. But where the 2003 film keeps the whole thimble kiss thing from the book, Disney drops that. Whether for time or because Walt thought it was too silly, who knows. Regardless, there's a reason why the Disney version of Tinkerbell has become so iconic. She's sassy, easily flustered, and her design is so perfect that it's small wonder she has become essentially the second mascot to the Disney company, only behind Mickey himself. Am I forgetting something? Oh yes, Peter's voice actor, because it's a boy! Before Disney's cartoon, the tradition was for Peter Pan to be a pants role played by a woman who could speak and sing in the higher register of a boy, yet have the adult body able to do all the required stunts and swordplay. Also, having already passed puberty tends to make your voice more reliable for a long schedule of performances, and while casting a young man on the cusp of adolescence paid off for Peter Pan, that choice would later come back to bite Disney in the ass with The Sword and the Stone, where recording lines took so long that Arthur had 3 different actors because their voices kept dropping. Oh, who was Peter's voice actor? Just some nobody named Bobby Driscoll. Don't worry about it. I'm sure it won't become relevant later. Now, I'm gonna have a lot to complain about with the rest of this film, but I have to admit the You Can Fly sequence remains one of the best in the entire Disney canon. As I already said, Disney did the kids flying perfectly. No other adaptation has even come close. The music is literally uplifting. I just love the harmonies and glissandos of the chorus. There's no better time to start. And at the end, as they're flying over London, the animators bring back out the multiplane camera, giving the clouds a believable depth. And we hear Peter's leitmotif again as we follow the children to the second star to the right. And it is here that we are formally introduced to our villain for the evening, Captain James Hook. In every iteration, the pirates hover somewhere between legitimately threatening and comically incompetent. For the Disney film, they start off more toward the former and slowly trend toward the latter as the film goes on. We zoom into the Jolly Roger, and the first thing we see and hear is the crew bitching about how this obsession with a preteen needs to stop. We need to get out sailing again, killing and pillaging and whatnot, which has the implication that one can simply sail to Neverland.
One does not simply
sail into Neverland. Can you imagine you're like out crabbing off the coast of Maine and there's a storm and whoops, there's some mermaids off the port bow. Anyway, the least threatening member of the crew is the first mate, Mr. Smee, who is adorable. When Hook emerges from the captain's cabin, his first act is to kill one of his own crewmates.
Shooting a man in the middle of his cadenza?
And then fire a cannon at children. Remember this violent, quick-to-act persona when we get to the end of this movie. Now, a lot of book readers have this impression in their head of Captain Hook being a gentleman fop with respect for the rules of combat and whatnot. And sure, in the book at one point he asks himself, "Have you been good form today?" But the guy is the sneakiest, slimiest son of a gun to ever crawl out of the sea.
You are without any doubt a rogue, a rascal, a villain, a thief, a scoundrel, and a mean, dirty, stinking, sniveling, sneaking, pimping, pocket-picking, thrice double damn, no good son of a bitch, and you sign your name. What do you think?
I'll take a dozen right now.
Disney Hook's backstabbing nature is very much in line with Barry's portrayal of him, where he's not afraid to ambush and duplicitously change tactics, even if he might feel bad about it later. So when the Disney iteration screams, this is not a character assassination. This is right in line with whom Hook is supposed to be. Peter treats all their interactions like a game with rules that need to be followed, even if sometimes those rules are invented in the moment, like Calvin Ball. But Hook is not playing a game. He is trying to win, even if that means cheating. And even when he holds himself to his word, he holds to the letter of the law, not the spirit.
But I have given me word not to lay a finger or a hook on Peter Pan.
Hook is not trying to play fair. He is trying to murder the little shit that cut his hand off. And to whom was that hand fed? Why, it's Tick-Tock, here he comes. The delightful contrabassoon leitmotif that accompanies the crocodile was actually written by Frank Churchill, and it was originally meant to be the melody for a song entitled Never Smile at a Crocodile. As some of you may remember from my Bambi video, Churchill died more than a decade before Peter Pan's release, which should give you an idea of just how long this movie was in production. The croc himself is a bit of fun, but the fact that he reduces Hook to a quivering mess really removes any kind of menace from his character, and this becomes a problem for the movie as a whole. I do understand that this is a children's fantasy taking place in a land of imagination, a mind palace playground where no harm can come to the players, but this is also a film with conflict and stakes, and when your conflict is resolved by a slow-moving yet hungry reptile, it just undermines any stakes. In the book, multiple characters from the different factions die, but in the Disney film, the only death is Mr. Cadenza getting shot out of the crow's nest, and that all happens off-screen. The ending of this movie, which we'll get to, is one of the weaker ones in the canon because at no point do you actually have any fear for the safety of any of these children. Speaking of those kids, they scatter like bowling pins when Long Tom starts lobbing cannonballs at them. Peter instructs Tinkerbell to guide Wendy and the boys to safety, and just like in the book, Tinkerbell is consumed by a jealous rage at the audacity of another woman insinuating herself into Peter's life. So let's talk about how the book and the film handle gender. For the most part, it isn't great, though Disney is a little bit better about it. The book is peppered with little asides like, you know what women are, and we also have this delightful little passage about Captain Hook. In his dark nature there was a touch of the feminine, as in all the great pirates, and it sometimes gave him intuitions. Is Captain Hook gay? Is he canonically gay, or maybe trans? I mean, that also leans into the troubling idea of reading Hook as a pedophile, which, I mean, come on, he's an adult constantly hunting for children. It ain't exactly that far of a reach. And the film, in its paraphrasing, comes up with even more dumb gender shit.
Girls talk too much.
Yes, girls talk too...
However, for all this misogynistic nonsense, the book actually has a surprisingly forward-thinking description of fairies. They live in nests on the tops of trees, and the mauve ones are boys and the white ones are girls, and the blue ones are just little sillies who are not sure what they are. J.M. Barrie said non-binary rights all the way back in 1911, and the colors are also just the trans flag. I propose the queer community start using little sillies as a term of endearment for the gender fluid and non-binary. Also, Barrie at one point has fairies drunkenly coming home after an, I quote, orgy, and I'm guessing the word meant something different a century ago, but it's very amusing to me now. At any rate, Peter returns just in time to save Wendy from the Lost Boys trying to murder her, and after Tinkerbell is banished for encouraging homicide, we get one of the better adaptational changes, I feel. The group splits up, with Peter taking Wendy to see the mermaids, and John and Michael joining the Lost Boys on another adventure. We'll talk about that in a moment. Having the group split lets us see both sides of the thing that happens, and adds more stakes. I also quite like the song Following the Leader. It's very catchy and also gives John something to do.
Following the leader, the leader, the leader. We're following the leader wherever he may go.
Meanwhile, the mermaids do more stupid misogynistic gender nonsense at Wendy for a bit.
We were only trying to drown her.
Before the sky darkens and we see Captain Hook and Mr. Snee kidnapping... oh dear. Tiger Lily! Well, time to talk about the first elephant in the room, how this story depicts Native Americans. In short, not great! In my Melody Time video, I discussed how the accomplishments and even existence of indigenous peoples are erased. But Peter Pan has the opposite problem. Much like J.K. Rowling when she tried coming up with a magical history for the United States, I don't think J.M. Barrie knew all that much about actual American Indians. I'm just gonna put this passage on the screen. I'm not saying it out loud. You can see how Barrie has conflated Asian and black stereotypes in with the Native American ones, making this even more of a clusterfuck. Not to mention that this is the word used to describe them throughout both the book and the film. Oh, and also, this is a racist slur. Please never use it to describe a Native American woman. Like I said, not great. Now, there is an argument that these are not actual Native Americans, merely an Edwardian child's conception of them. So it makes more sense for them to be inaccurate, but then why include them at all? Imagine if instead of mermaids, pirates, and Indians, Barrie had written about goblins, ninjas, and the French, who were a savage race of stripes and beret-wearing mimes who fought with baguettes and cigarettes when they weren't immediately surrendering.
Bonjour, you cheese-eating surrender monkeys!
Mermaids do not exist, and pirate is a job description. Indian refers to a culture of people, and that culture has historically been on the receiving end of a whole lot of bad shit, as I detailed in the Melody Time video. So turning them into a gaggle of juvenile fever dream stereotypes that grovel at the feet of their great white father is more than just insulting, it's harmful. I'm not even gonna talk about what makes the red man red, except to say that of all the misguided pieces of the Disney canon, that is the one that has the best argument for being censored and never seeing the light of day again. Because it still influences how white people think about Native Americans. The 2003 film has John turn red from being kissed by Tiger Lily, and I just want to burn that moment with napalm, for fuck's sake. Now, apart from that,
Stupid song!
Disney actually does a little, teensy tiny marginal bit better than Barrie in representing Native Americans, probably because he actually was American and not British. At least these Indians are merely conflations of different actual tribes and don't speak in caricatures from entirely different continents. Totem poles and teepees were from completely distinct cultures, but at least they're both from what is now the continental United States. However, they still kept the Barrie invention of
There is no path through water to the happy hunting ground.
What the fuck does that even mean? As far as I can tell, no Native American culture has ever believed in something called a happy hunting ground. That was made up by white people, probably conflating indigenous ideas of the afterlife with Valhalla. But while Disney may have been marginally better in the racism department, he outdoes Barrie in the misogyny department here by downgrading Tiger Lily from the leader of the Neverland Indians to the chief's daughter. Yes, we can't, ladies. Oh, and Disney invented
Cannibal Cove.
And I think we're all glad they never actually went there. What a shit show that would have been. With the racism out of the way, we have time for more misogyny. First, because Tinkerbell is a
jealous female.
She betrays Peter Pan to Captain Hook, though I will say drunk Smee is delightful.
Take this down, Smee.
And Hook enticing Tinkerbell is actually fairly well done. Meanwhile, Wendy is singing at the Lost Boys that they need a mother. Well, at least Catherine Beaumont got better at singing.
Your mother and mine.
The book has Wendy spending almost all her time in the hideout pretending to be their mother. Now I can see that as just children playing house, but like, do kids even play house anymore? I never did as a kid, and it just enforces these heteronorms that honestly we could do with fewer of. Book Wendy spends literal days darning socks and handing out medicine and making sure the Lost Boys are in bed by 7. At least Disney Wendy has some amount of self-respect.
You dare to come near me again! Wendy!
When Michael insists that Wendy is his mother in the film, it feels more like forgetfulness and delusion, rather than the book where Wendy has actually been acting as his mother the whole time. Disney Wendy, rather understandably, does not want all this goddamn responsibility being a child herself and convinces them all to leave for London. Well, everyone except Peter, of course. But Captain Hook has been lying in wait, having gotten out of Tinkerbell the location of Hangman's Tree. The Lost Boys hideout. Thank you, Villainous, for needlessly censoring that in your update a couple years back. Now, in the book, this is where Hook poisons Peter's medicine, that is, the water that Wendy leaves for him to pretend to be medicine. But I guess the Disney folks thought that whole plot beat was cringe and stupid, so instead Hook just leaves a bomb. Whatever works, give the bomb a Lorcana card, why not? Tinkerbell rushes to save Peter and dies. I'm sorry, she doesn't die. She's fine. She took a bomb 10 times her size right to the face and is just fine. I think we missed something. We did miss something. In the original play, at this point, Peter is supposed to turn to the audience and ask them to clap if they believe in fairies. Walt and company tried this for the film, but eventually decided that was just too cringe to ask of the movie going public, and just had Peter cry over her fairy corpse for 10 seconds and then cut to the Lost Boys tied up in the Jolly Roger. I had to do that take 3 times because I was laughing so hard. And honestly, I think that's just lacking in creativity, because the part the 2003 film did best was this exact scene.
I do believe in fairies. I do. I do believe in fairies. I do.
Do you believe in fairies?
You what?
I do believe in fairies.
Do believe in fairies.
I do.
I do believe in fairies. I do believe in fairies. I do.
I do believe in fairies. I do.
Like, I challenge every single one of you not to start crying during this. It's so well done. Alright, we have to finish up the Disney film. Yeah, there's a bit of a tiff with the pirates. Peter shows up and saves the day. The pirates are lame and embarrass themselves repeatedly. Not a single child is brutally manslaughtered in cold blood. And where Hook is finally swallowed by the crocodile in the book, here his pitiful exit is turned into a joke. As I said earlier, there is no tension because the stakes have been lowered so far by the utter lack of threat the pirates pose. Also, Peter is saved by Wendy screaming his name not once but twice.
Peter! Peter!
Kind of feels like her main purpose in the story, kind of like how Finn was reduced to screaming and that trash fire of an ending. Let me know in the comments, by the way, if you'd like to see me tackle the Star Wars nonology once I finish with Disney. At least this film ends on a relative high note. Enchanting the Jolly Roger with pixie dust so it rises into the air was an inspired choice by the Disney studio, so iconic that the 2003 film repeats it. I wouldn't be surprised if Ron Clements and John Musker used it as inspiration for Treasure Planet. I also like better the film's take that all of this happens in the span of an evening, so by the time the Darlings return home from their party, the children are back already. The whole, our kids have been missing for months part of the original book has always been very weird to me, particularly since it was a deliberate decision on the part of the children to both leave and stay. As Barry put it, thus children are ever ready when novelty knocks to desert their dearest ones. Now the film cuts off there, but the book keeps going for for a whole other chapter, and it's honestly the best and most poignant one. Peter keeps coming to visit Wendy year after year as she grows older and older, and when she's too old, he visits her daughter and then her granddaughter, the cycle continuing. But then Wendy asks Peter about their old adventures. "Who is Captain Hook?" he asked with interest when she spoke of the arch-enemy. "Don't you remember," she asked, amazed, "how you killed him and saved all our lives?" "I forget them after I kill them," he replied carelessly. When she expressed a doubtful hope that Tinker Bell would be glad to see her, he said, "Who's Tinker Bell?" Because Peter Pan truly is Endymion, stuck in his youth, in a Groundhog Day where he never remembers the day before, eternally in the present, never able to grow or change. He may live forever, but he is neither a past nor a future, but he's still happy with that state of affairs. "Would you send me to school?" he inquired craftily. "Yes." "And then to an office?" "I suppose so." "Soon I would be a man?" "Very soon." "I don't want to go to school and learn solemn things," he told her passionately. "I don't want to be a man." There's a part in Hook where Robin Williams as Peter is remembering leaving for Neverland for the first time.
"I was afraid because I didn't want to grow up, because everybody who grows up has to die someday."
And that's incorrect. Peter does not fear death. At one point in the novel, he's marooned on a rock, waiting for the tide to come in and drown him, and he thinks to himself what is perhaps the most famous line from the book: "To die will be an awfully big adventure." Peter isn't afraid to die. He's afraid of becoming boring, of living life in the prison of an office, of being told what to do, of being stifled. He's free and doesn't want to lose that freedom. In the book, the Lost Boys join the Darling household, and as they grow up, they forget how to fly. Want of practice, they called it, but what it really meant was that they no longer believed. Captain Hook also, in his own way, never grew up. He doesn't really behave like an adult. He throws tantrums and acts just as selfishly as Peter. He's obsessed with a youth who stole his hand and haunted by the specter of his own mortality and a literal ticking clock.
Captain James Hook's afraid of time! Ticking away!
Hook and Peter are perfect foils for one another, one unable to grow or learn anything new, unchanging and naive, the other clever and adaptable, but desperate to stay the same. Let's briefly touch on the other notable adaptations of this story. The 2003 live-action version is generally more faithful apart from action hero Wendy, but the first half is rather rushed. The second half fares better, especially with the "I do believe in fairies" scene, as I mentioned. I also love a good prop. That nursery window is fantastic. What brings this one down for me is how uncomfortably sexy Peter is. This is a 13-year-old child. Why is he smoldering at the camera? Likely this was attempting to capture the preteen girl demographic, and having spoken to my female friends from high school, it largely succeeded, but coming back to it as a grown-up, it's really awkward. Hook, helmed by Steven Spielberg, tackles the what if of Peter deciding to marry Wendy's granddaughter and grow up, only for his kids to be kidnapped by the titular captain. The first half in particular is very well paced, but it lags a bit in the second half when it starts to get self-indulgent and self-important. Nonetheless, it has some great quotes.
"I've lost my marbles."
Peter, you've become a pirate.
Especially from Robin Williams ad-libbing.
What am I saying? I don't know who my mother was. I'm an orphan and I'd never taken drugs because I missed the 60s. I was an accountant.
And Bob Hoskins as Smee might just be my favorite take on the character.
What is that, an apostrophe?
But this one also has an uncomfortably sexualized teen in... But if I'm being honest, Rufio kicks ass. He's great. He even gets a great death scene.
I wish I had a dad like you.
But then he's just immediately forgotten. The movie just moves on like nothing happened. Chat, pour one out for my brother Rufio. Press F to pay respects. I think that's it for notable film representations of Peter Pan. I don't think there are any, oh no. Oh god, please no. Anything but that. Fuck. Now I have to talk about this piece of shit. Peter Pan features as the villain of the Rescue Rangers movie that went straight to Disney Plus during the pandemic. Why? Well, because for whatever reason, the filmmakers wanted their villain to be a resentful child actor who couldn't get parts anymore after going through puberty. Apparently their initial idea was to do this with Charlie Brown, and honestly, I can kind of see that, but since it would be easier to get the rights for a Disney character, they went with Peter Pan. And now we really do need to talk about Bobby Driscoll. As a kid, Bobby was perhaps Walt's most prized child actor, starring in Song of the South, So Dear to My Heart, and Treasure Island. He even received an honorary Oscar in 1950. But Peter Pan, perhaps the pinnacle of his career, would end up being his last major film appearance. Puberty had rendered him, in Walt's eyes, unsuitable for the sorts of roles he played before, particularly since he got hit pretty hard with acne and his contract at Disney was terminated. This was right after he appeared in a television ad where this happened.
Well, take my advice, bud, and give it up. You'll never make the grade. The boy hasn't got the face, he hasn't got it.
Fuck you, Charlie McCarthy, or should I say, Edgar Bergen! All of this led Bobby to largely retire from acting, and he was put into a public school where he was bullied. In his words, "The other kids didn't accept me. They treated me as one apart. I tried desperately to be one of the gang. When they rejected me, I fought back, became belligerent and cocky, and was afraid all the time." He became addicted to drugs and was arrested more than once. Eventually, he moved to New York City, trying to break into Broadway. In 1968, he was found dead in a deserted apartment. It wasn't until 1969 that his body was identified, when his mother finally went looking for him. He was never moved from the pauper's grave he was originally buried in, but his estranged father was later buried next to him. And the makers of the Rescue Rangers movie had the audacity to make that real-life tragedy into a villainous plot beat for their ugly little movie. They've claimed not to know the real history of Bobby Driscoll, but it's too much of a coincidence for my taste. If that story sounds familiar, it's because all of this has happened before, and it may very well happen again. In my memory, it was Jake Lloyd. After being ruthlessly mocked by his classmates for his performance in The Phantom Menace, he too stopped acting, developed severe mental health problems, and has been arrested and institutionalized. Now, not every child actor has a tragic downfall. Certainly Natalie Portman and Daniel Radcliffe have done very well for themselves, but they seem to largely be the exceptions. Most child actors get out of the business as they grow up, whether purely from a change in interests or because of the pressures of either the studio system or their peers. If we're going to continue to cast children in films, maybe we need to do a better job of protecting them. So why do we chase youth? Maybe we shouldn't. Rather than desperately trying to preserve or relive our own childhoods, we should make sure to protect the childhoods of actual children. Being an actor, particularly a famous one, puts you under such scrutiny that it's a wonder that any child actor makes it to adulthood alive. Let kids be kids. But also don't try to police what being a grown-up means either. Life is hard enough already without telling someone they're too old for Barbies or Hot Wheels or Disney movies. Let people find joy wherever they want to, as long as they're not being super racist or misogynistic about it. Speaking of, is Disney's Peter Pan worth a watch? If you're an adult who grew up with it, I don't think you should feel any shame in going back to it. There are some really gorgeous parts to it, and you can fast forward through the cringe. But I can't in good conscience recommend that young children be shown this film. At a young age, an impressionable age, kids will have no idea that what they are watching is an inaccurate and harmful depiction of Native Americans, and they may parrot those stereotypes. I know I certainly did, and part of my growing up was unlearning them. Disney has gotten a lot better with indigenous representation in recent years, with Lilo and Stitch, Brother Bear, and Moana, and now there are even children's TV shows made with indigenous input, like Molly of Denali on PBS. If you're going to show Peter Pan to your kids, I encourage you to have a discussion with them beforehand that what they're about to watch is a product of its time, and that some parts of it are inaccurate, harmful caricatures. Kids are smarter than we give them credit for, but you do still have to guide them. That is our responsibility as adults. As always, I appreciate my Patreon patrons: Elijah Black, Eric Wagner, Avery and their ADHDs, Jinx KB, and Savannah Mighty Zebra, as well as all the rest. This content is funded by viewers like you. It's only $5 a month, or $10 if you want me to say your name at the end here. I've also announced some patron milestones, which, if reached, I'll make a music video to celebrate. Regardless, join me next time as we discuss Class with Lady and the Tramp.